Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is This Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Hubenyuk. This is what we prepared for you tonight. A coup ousts the leader of the Luhansk separatists. We explain. Are displaced persons the key to peace in Ukraine? Anne Applebaum talks about the 1930s Soviet man-made famine, the Holodomor. Brussels has just hosted the Eastern Partnership Summit. But is the partnership meaningful? What threat does Russia pose to the EU? We bring you the view from Poland. The head of the separatists in Luhansk had resigned as the result of a coup. Igor Plotnitsky, who with Russian support ran the territory for the last 3 years, has fled to Moscow. Yet Plotnitsky may stay on as an envoy to represent so-called Luhansk People Republic to the Minsk Accords. Overall, the Luhansk coup, far from the first incident of separatists on separatist conflict, came as the apparent culmination of a standoff among the Luhansk separatists. This week, virtually everybody was following the situation in Luhansk, but hardly everyone understood what was actually happening. So let's break it down. I'd like to show the map. First, we can see the location of Luhansk. There it is. And separatists control the territory in 2 different regions in Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. Compared to Donetsk, Luhansk was always considered more poor, smaller and less important. Yet it shares a long border with Russia. Both self-proclaimed republics have strange relations. They are controlled by Moscow. They fight with the Ukrainian government, but their relations are kind of strange, and they even have the custom regime with each other. So there is a kind of a border. So now let's watch our report explaining this week's events in Luhansk.
On November 21, armed men in balaclavas and unmarked uniforms blockaded administrative buildings in the center of the occupied city of Luhansk. Local separatist media reported that the guerrillas had received an order to seize the buildings from Igor Plotnitsky, the self-proclaimed interior minister of the unrecognized Luhansk People's Republic. Local separatist media reported that the guerrillas had received an order to seize the buildings from Igor Plotnitsky, the self-proclaimed interior minister of the unrecognized Luhansk People's Republic. That evening, Luhansk residents reported that a column of military vehicles had entered the city. The next morning, separatist media reported that Plotnitsy's armed forces had stormed the building of the so-called LPR prosecutor's office. During the raid, more than 20 employees of the prosecutor's office were arrested, including the unrecognized republic's military prosecutor and acting civil prosecutor. After the arrests, LPR leader Igor Plotnitsky gave a press conference in which he announced that shortly before the uprising, he had sacked Plotnitsky in connection with a criminal case against the so-called interior minister for illegally residing in a stolen home. Plotnitsky called Plotnitsy's actions an attempt at an armed seizure of power.
Plotnitsky was suspended from his position, but it looks like the little man has been overblown by big ambitions, and for some reason he has decided that the court ruling was not a law for him. And today we have this situation, which I would say is not going very well for him.
Plotnitsky did not wait long to respond. The self-proclaimed interior minister rejected reports of his dismissal and called the presence of armed men in the city centre a special operation against Ukrainian saboteurs. He claimed the situation in the city was under control, and the men in unmarked uniforms were from the neighbouring self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, and that they had come to assist their neighbours.
During this long investigation, we have uncovered a large number of agents of influence of the Ukrainian special services who have deeply infiltrated our republic's power structures. At the moment in this situation, we are receiving help from friendly people and law enforcement agencies of the Donetsk People's Republic.
On November 23rd, the Russian independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta reported that the administrative buildings in Luhansk had been surrounded by armed men, who likely included employees of the LPR Interior Ministry and the security ministries of the Donetsk People's Republic. The newspaper also reported that Plotnitsky, the head of the so-called presidential administration, and the director of the Luhansk state television and radio company had all left the unrecognized republic. That evening, Konstantin Dolgov, the former Donetsk separatist leader who had escaped to Moscow, unveiled a video which depicted Plotnitsky in an airport in the Russian capital. The Luhansk leader subsequently resigned from office. But according to Novaya Gazeta, Plotnitsky will reportedly return to Luhansk as the unrecognized republic's envoy to the peace negotiations in Minsk. Whether he comes back to the LPR or not, Plotnitsky's name is on the Minsk Accords documents. Just Igor Plotnitsky, without his position listed. That likely means we haven't seen the last of him.
So that's exactly why Igor Plotnitsky's fate is important. Indeed, it actually comes down to one signature. You can see that. These are the Minsk Accords. You can see the signature of Heidi Televini. She represents the OSCE, the former Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma, as well the Russian ambassador Zurabov. But below, you can also see Igor Plotnitsky and Alexander Zakharchenko, who is the head of Donetsk Separatist, and neither of them have official positions listed on the document. That means that officially they might not represent the so-called republics. Now, the acting head of the so-called Luhansk People Republic is Leonid Pasechnik. He used to run the self-proclaimed republic's security service, and below the war, he was a member of the Ukrainian SBU. You can see him at the photo. Who is him? What it all means? My colleague Matthew Kupfer spoke with Andriy Dikhtyarenko, a Radio Svoboda journalist and the editor-in-chief of Luhansk Realnaya Gazeta newspaper, and we will continue following the story.
Let's start with the most direct question. What exactly is going on in occupied Luhansk? In Luhansk, there was a real coup organized by security agents. The situation was quite stable for 3 years, but after Plotnitsky came to power, it changed quite drastically. Moreover, this military coup developed practically like any junta's rise to power. There was a military seizure of power. People from different forces armed with guns came to the streets, seized the administrative buildings, and seized military installations. They kicked out their rivals, kicked out the leader of the so-called LPR, practically ejected him from Luhansk. All of this gave Moscow an easy choice between two options. Either Plotnitsky leaves completely, or his power will serve solely a nominal presentational function. As we can see, Moscow went for the first option. De facto, Plotnitsky doesn't govern the area anymore. He is only valued for the signatures he previously wrote on the Minsk agreements. People in Luhansk say that these signatures are practically what saved his life. How did the conflict between Plotnitsky and the self-proclaimed interior minister Igor Plotnitsky start? This conflict started in 2015. It wasn't just with Kornet, but also with the so-called LPR state security minister, Leonid Pasechnik. 2 years ago, Pasechnik and Kornet arrested the so-called minister of the coal industry, Dmitry Lyamin. They accused Lyamin of corruption, of arranging shadow schemes with various Ukrainian oligarchs. But Plotnitsky claimed that Pasechnik and Kornet had no rights to detain the minister without his permission. Pasechnik and Kornet refused to free him, and even back then, 2 years ago, this situation could have escalated into an armed standoff like we have now. But it didn't. Everyone remained in their jobs. Pasechnik and Kornet retained their roles, and Plotnitsky continued to be the head of the LPR. But even then, it became clear that the so-called leadership of the LPR and the DPR, because the DPR has the same situation, they have no control over parts of the security agencies that are located in their territory. Rumors started spreading that the political system and the security system of the occupied parts of the Donbas region are controlled by different curators in Moscow. We then realized that Vladislav Surkov controls the political part mostly, that being Plotnitsky, Zakharchenko, and their subordinates. And the LPR security services obey the relevant security agencies in the Russian Federation. And that's exactly what led to the political crisis we're currently witnessing in Luhansk. This status quo, or maybe even Moscow's fear to transfer the entire power, the control over the armed groups and illegal structures, to one person who is considered the head of the DPR or LPR. Such desire to put eggs in different baskets probably played a dirty trick on them. Yesterday we found out that Plotnitsky resigned. Now he's eager to come back to the LPR as an envoy for the Minsk agreements. What does this mean for Minsk, and what does this mean for the future of the separatist movement in Luhansk? First of all, we know for sure that Plotnitsky did not want to resign. And that's a very important thing. We don't have a video address of him saying that he's resigning. Virtually 2 days ago at a press conference, he said that everything that's going on in Luhansk is an attempt at a political coup. So de facto, we have coup organizers appointing themselves as the new leadership of the LPR on Plotnitsky's behalf. That's the first point. It's difficult to judge whether we can trust their words when they say that Plotnitsky will come back to Luhansk as the signatory to the Minsk agreements and as the future envoy of the so-called LPR in Minsk. We only know this from their words. In any case, we need to have some sort of reaction in Ukraine as the other side of the process. In any case, we need to have some kind of reaction in Ukraine because it's the other side of this process. There also needs to be an official reaction from Russia, which also plays a role in the process, and a reaction from the OSCE. I think that the Luhansk events will slow down the Minsk process for some time, to say the least. That said, it's been slowed down for quite a while now. But the normal development of the Minsk agreement, the execution of the Minsk agreements will become even harder. Let me give you a simple example. For over a year, we had no official exchanges of prisoners on both sides of the demarcation line. Only just recently, we started hearing statements about potential exchanges in the nearest future. Putin even met with Viktor Medvedchuk, who is one of Ukraine's representatives who deals with prisoner exchanges. Putin even met with Viktor Medvedchuk, who is one of Ukraine's representatives who deals with prisoner exchanges. Putin rang Zakharchenko and Plotnitsky. He asked them to hurry up with forming the lists, hurry up with the exchange process. Now we have one of the people who used to talk to Putin over the phone being no longer active. He's been ousted. Hence, that's why this process is likely to stall. The new head of the LPR is now Leonid Pasechnik, the so-called former head of the Luhansk Ministry of Defense. Who is he? He is a former officer of Ukraine's security services. He used to head the K department, which fought smuggling in Luhansk region, and he was quite successful in that role. In 2006, he gained prominence across Ukraine when he stopped an attempt to smuggle a large amount of money in dollars on the border with Russia. Everyone was positively surprised to see an officer of Ukraine's Security Council who was not corrupt, who rejected this money entirely despite being offered a big bribe. He was honored with a medal by Ukraine's then President Viktor Yushchenko. But later, as we heard from Pasechnik himself in interviews, that moment didn't allow him to grow in his career. His rivals started tempting him to take part in different corrupt schemes. He claimed that he rejected these offers, that he has his head screwed on and didn't want to damage his reputation. As a result, he was demoted to the local level in one of these cities in the Luhansk region, serving in Ukraine's security services there. So it looks like these unrealized ambitions pushed him to join the occupant side and to head the LPR's state security ministry under the FSB control. So it looks like these unrealized ambitions pushed him to join the occupant side and to head the LPR's state security ministry under the control of Russia's Federal Security Service. Another important thing to mention, in 2014, LPR's state security ministry wasn't even based in Luhansk. Its main function was to control the state border between Russia and the uncontrolled parts of the Luhansk region from Russia's side. Pasechnik, in his conversation with one of the security agents by the name of Fominov, admitted to dealing with security, but not the security of Luhansk, but the state security of the Russian Federation on the border of the uncontrolled part of Ukraine. So that means he's a person close to Russia. It means that he is directly controlled by Russia's Federal Security Service. His leadership are the Federal Security Service generals. That's why, in fact, he even has the power to remove Surkov's people from office, which is precisely what happened. There is a school of thought that the Kremlin isn't happy with Plotnitsky. Is that true? And if so, what exactly are they not happy about? First of all, the Kremlin wasn't pleased with anyone, be it Zakharchenko or Plotnitsky. Plotnitsky was more problematic for them because of his love of conflicts. There were constant murders, dismissals of so-called ministers, corruption and embezzlement scandals, scandals about the looting of humanitarian aid, scandals tied to the murders and unusual deaths of various warlords in Luhansk. Plotnitsky's inability to cement a part of occupied Donbass as his own, despite all his efforts, was the first and foremost thing that annoyed Russia. Additionally, Zakharchenko, as one of the separatists who is more well-known, was probably a better fit for this legend that the events in the Donbass are an attempt by the local people to have a structure different from Ukraine's nationalistic ideology. There were different people working on this image, like the writer Zahar Prilepin. Zakharchenko, unlike Plotnitsky, did a better job of making it look like things are calm and in control in Donetsk.
There are over 1.6 million officially registered internally displaced people in Ukraine, and many more who aren't registered. But according to a new publication by the Atlantic Council and the United States Institute of Peace, the people who moved from Donbass to the rest of the country hold the key to peace, integration, and building bridges in Ukraine. The Atlantic Council, Geisha Gonzalez, join us live. Welcome for being out that late now, just coming from the US. My general thing, there are less. It looks like we're following the war, we're following the issues with the security, but there is somehow a bit less attention to the internally displaced at this stage. It kind of considered the issue is solved. Can you put into context, the figure? The most of the people from Ukraine, they stayed here. And as well, why you see that as a crucial thing.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, it is 1.6 million internally displaced persons in Ukraine. That is 9th in the world. And of course, there has not been enough international attention to this issue, despite the large figure. That is that includes 230,000 children as well.
We do, by the way, have this figure just to say that the half of the people is really stayed close to the unoccupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. So the half of them are pensioners. We understand that some of the pensioners actually stayed at the controlled areas, but they need to register the pension. Still, there is a huge number. There are a lot of children and even disabled.
Clearly, some of the most vulnerable people are among these figures. The Atlantic Council does strive to make sure that we're putting a spotlight in the most pressing issues facing Ukraine, and this is one of them. And that's why this report came about. The United States, we were able to launch it on Capitol Hill with Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, who really highlighted this issue. Ambassador Kurt Volker actually quoted our report weeks after, talking about the importance of IDPs and how we should be paying attention to this issue. And on Tuesday, we will be hosting an event with the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, where we're bringing Ambassador Yovanovich on this.
And in particular, why usually when we speak about internally displaced and the issue at the Hromadske as well, these are the issues about how the communities, how they are living in the new places, to what extent they are integrated. I think it's important to explain to the international audience that, there is no any different ethnicity. There is no any different, it's a different in Crimea. We have Crimean Tatars, but overall, especially we're speaking about the people from Donbass, they are the Ukrainian, they have the same religion, there is very little, usually, so it should be very easy for them to, move at some point. But the unexpected finding was that they could be the key for the peace.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, of course. They can be a key to sustaining peace because they are the bridge builders. They build bridges between the East and the West. They contribute to our communities. They contribute to local economies. There are several examples on at the report that will highlight this. But they are faced with many blockades when they are trying to be integrated in the communities. In 2016, the socials payments were suspended. In 2016, later that year, they were not allowed to vote in local elections without losing their IDP status, which would prevent them from getting benefits. And these are things that the Ukrainian government really needs to work on, because they're Ukrainians first and foremost.
So probably the most important part of the report is really their recommendations for the decision makers, of course here in Ukraine and in the US and international community. Can you really point out what at this stage is important to be done?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost, empowering the Ministry of IDPs, giving them the power to actually enforce their mandate is key. And then, restoring the payments that they had in 2016, making sure that they're able to vote in the local elections and make it easier for them to integrate themselves into the local community.
In generally, how does the report assess the way to what extent the Ukrainian government is tackling the issue? It's not that satisfactory.
It's not satisfactory. There's definitely a lot of work to be done, and that is why we wrote the report, because we need to highlight this issue, make sure that it's elevated internationally, and really push the Ukrainian government towards the right direction on this issue.
So what would be also the recommendation for the counterparts? What would be how it would be the way to enforce better policies?
I think for the United States, the key is going to be to tie this to our commitment to Ukrainian reforms. I know that the Atlantic Council, the Eurasia Center, at the heart of our Ukraine and Europe initiative is tracking reforms and making sure that Ukraine remains in the path towards reforms. So tying that with Ukrainian reforms, security, and the prosperity going forward.
As I probably really add on that, because we're following closely the talks, the Ukraine-US relations, and mainly the issues which are raised is about the security, is about the providing lethal weapon, and it's definitely about the reforms, the justice reforms and the other. So that's interesting, really, that the issues of internally displaced is raised. And maybe what else, for instance, so you suggest that the people in the Capitol Hill should, mention all these issues while meeting the Ukrainian leaders?
No, absolutely. I think this needs to be brought in the same table when we're talking about security, when we're talking about reforms, when we're talking about the future of Ukraine. We should also be talking about the IDPs.
And what can the international community do? As we also mentioned, there is this figure which remained, it wasn't surprised, just a 10% of kind of the financial support of 240 million of US dollars, which kind of needed, were provided. So what are else your suggestions to, besides maybe the money, but probably funds as well, so critical?
I mean, the money would be helpful. But I think the most important thing that we can do, especially, the Atlantic Council and our role in this entire issue, is to just make sure that we continue to highlight the issue and press the importance of solving this issue.
So overall, how you find the this humanitarian, looking at the work of what you are doing and solving the conflicts globally, sometimes we focus on the security. The fact that you've done that, it's already highlight the fact that you cares about the humanitarian issues. But how can you connect as well and say how critical the solution of the humanitarian issues are important for the security? As there would be people say, first there is a security, first let's solve let's finish the war, and then we'll deal with the people.
It's not as linear as many people would like to think. I think it all comes together. Yes, security is a very important thing, but part of being secure means making sure that you allow all the opportunities to all of your people, and the IDPs are Ukrainians, so they should be integrated as such.
Yesha, so much. Thank you for coming at this hour. We really appreciate your impact, and probably would encourage our readers to follow the report and to listen to the stories. Hromadske is also on this topic, and I'll be back in a second. Every November, Ukraine remembers the victims of Holodomor, the Soviet man-made mass famine that claimed the lives of over 4 million Ukrainians in 1930s. To this day, the famine remains one of the most controversial human rights violations in the Soviet history. It was forbidden to mention Holodomor during the Soviet times. It was very hard to get these photos even, while there is hardly any Ukrainian family who hadn't been affected. The exact number of victims, while undoubtedly huge, remains hotly debated internationally. And while Ukraine calls the Holodomor a genocide, official Moscow strongly denies this. This autumn, journalist and historian Anne Applebaum released Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, a book chronicling the Holodomor. This past week, she visited Kyiv and sat down with Hromadske to talk about the Holodomor, its legacy and its significance for modern Ukraine.
Well, there are some things that surprised me or interested me as a historian. I mean, one of them was the way in which in 1932 Stalin is still so focused on the Civil War. This was revealing to me how much how bothered he was by the Ukrainian Revolution and by the rebellion of 1918 and 19, and how much this still was part of his thinking 20 years later. I suppose, though, that if I understand your question, you're asking what's shocking about the famine story. And of course, there are a lot of things that are shocking about it. It's a very difficult story to write. For me, it's even more difficult than the Gulag, which is another book that I wrote. Because Gulag, people left and they wrote very beautiful memoirs, and there's some kind of people have learned something, or they learn about human morality and they can write something. The famine, really, there's nothing good you can say about it. Nothing, it's a terrible tragedy. It ends awfully. A lot of illiterate, peasants die. But I suppose the most shocking thing really is you realize how indifferent most of society was. I mean, most people knew there was a famine. People in the cities knew, people in Russia knew, and yet there was never any reaction to it. There was never any attempt to commemorate it. And the people who had carried it out never paid any price for it. So the famine, as you know, was actually, it wasn't caused by chaos. It was caused by people going into the homes of peasants and taking their food. And so there were some people who did this. They were the activists who went from house to house and confiscated food. And they were indifferent to having done that. They never were punished for doing it. They lived on. There's no evidence there was any terrible moment when they felt guilty. And it's this indifference that's probably the most shocking.
How do you think this event in particularly influenced kind of the identity and the psyche of the nation? In a way that, for a while it was concealed, though everybody knew. At the same time, there is a feeling of the victimhood. But in another case, any kind of this tragedy has some also a lot of a negative impact on there.
So I think you're right. The secrecy is very important. The fact that it was covered up and people weren't allowed to talk about it. And that meant that probably added to the sense that you've had in Ukraine. Actually, you've had in Ukraine for for a long time. Of this mistrust for the state and this feeling that the state is somehow alien, that we don't trust it, whatever they say is a lie, we don't believe it. And this feeling that, we are the people over here and the state is over there. And this is a problem in today's Ukraine. How do you create a sense of patriotism if you have people who don't trust their institutions? And on the other side, how do you make the institutions feel that they are responsible to ordinary people? The cause of corruption really, the source of corruption in Ukraine and in other places is this lack of sense of responsibility. People who have political power feel that entitles them to steal. And, some of this feeling dates from this period, both because of the famine and because of the of the assault on the intellectual class that accompanied it.
And what are the particular, Soviet strategies to make it happen, to make it happen? The society is so indifferent, to have this way that, with the support of its own population, that tragedy is possible.
So the kind of Soviet propaganda against the peasantry, and in particular against kulaks, begins already in the 1920s. I mean, actually, it begins at this time of the Civil War. And in the late 1920s, and then at the time of collectivization, it becomes extreme. It's constant. And the argument from the state is that these kulaks are standing in the way of the revolution. And all of your problems, you, the proletariat, you people in Kyiv or in Kharkiv or in Moscow, all of your problems, the reason why you are poor is because these people are stealing your food. And these old, illiterate, backwards peasants are keeping the food for themselves, and that's why we're all so hungry. And this line is repeated over and over again and at the same time, inside villages, there are these very sharp divisions are made. And favoritism and, help and so on are shown to those peasants who will cooperate with the authorities, and those ones who won't cooperate or who won't join the collective farms or who are more wealthy or more successful, they are kulaks. And the policy is to both make the cities hate the countryside and also to make inside the villages these two different groups fight against each other. So it's the deliberate creation of what we would now call partisanship, and this division of the country into parts, and this feeling that, this creation of hatred between different groups. And it was very, very successful.
Is it in that way something unique, or, we can compare that particular, way the system work with something else, with some other tradition?
Look, this is how partisanship works now. You don't have to, you can look at modern Ukraine, you can look at other, lots of other countries. There are politicians who seek to unify people and seek to create a message that will bring the country together. And then there are politicians who seek to divide people and speak only to their constituency. This is how Donald Trump won the election in the United States, by speaking, to one group. This is how, Yanukovych sought to win elections here by, if you can divide people and if you can make your group of activists really angry and support you and back you, and then you can win power. It's a tactic that we see in lots of places.
In your previous interview, you mentioned that that the differentiation between the de facto, what you would consider the genocide, what is the legal term, and really, what is the most important to understand what had happened for Ukrainians rather than to prove it was a genocide, but still. In all the international communication, especially with, for instance, with the Russians or with the post-Soviet, there is this question, was it, why Ukrainians are pushing? Well, I think this issue is still so irritating to a lot of people in Russia in the way we communicate, and, in particular, Holodomor. And then it's such a tragedy that, you don't. Sometimes when there is a tragedy, why you deny that somebody has bigger or like a smaller or a scale? You understand, like in a case of Holocaust, you don't deny something bad happened, just having that something worse happened to somebody else. And that's exactly what's happening to Holodomor, and that's probably which is striking.
I think it's because there is, in the end, a deep connection that the Holodomor was connected to. It happened in part. It was partly an attack on the Ukrainian national movement. Stalin wanted to repress the peasants in order to prevent this creation, this flowering of an independent or a sovereign Ukraine. And then I think it's the case that the Ukrainian national movement in the late 1980s and early 1990s also began to talk about the Holodomor once again. And I think the Russians dislike it because it's connected in their heads to the drive for Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. And it's one of the aspects of history that makes the Ukrainians different from the Russians. And, you know, there's a Russian narrative about Soviet history, which is we were all in this together, and we fought Hitler, and we constructed the Soviet Union, and we rebuilt Kyiv in the 1950s and so on, you know, and this was all something that we all did together. And the Holodomor is a story that, that shows there were, in the end, actually some differences inside the Soviet Union, and there were different experiences. And I think that bothers particularly this Russian government, which I think is really, fear isn't really the right word, but really dislikes the example that Ukraine is setting. You know, and actually maybe I should use that. I mean, is afraid of having protests in Russia of the kind that you had here on the Maidan. And I think they connect the famine and the arguments about the famine to that story.
At the same time, what would you think is the way to remember the Holodomor?
So, I mean, I've said this today a couple of times. I mean, in my view, the best thing you could do to commemorate the victims of the famine is to build a society where this can never happen again. To think about, you know, when you talk about Ukraine and when you talk about what kind of country you want to live in, think about building a society where this is impossible. And this is really the best thing you can do. I mean, of course you should teach people the story, and of course you should argue about the story. And there are very, very good, you know, Ukrainian historians who've been writing very well about it. I don't know how well it's taught in schools or how much debate there is about it. You know, but this is obviously, you know, it should be a part of civic education as well as a part of history education. You know, here is a disaster that happened in our country. Teaching people and talking about how to make sure what are the institutions, what are the ways of thinking we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. This is the best thing you could do.
You can see full version of the interview with Anne Applebaum, where we also discuss Russian interference in the US elections, RT registered as a foreign agent, as well as the role of the big tech in modern information warfare. All that you can find at our webpage, en.hromadske.ua. As well, go to Facebook and Twitter, search for Hromadske and Hromadske International, and there you'll see what we do in the social media. And I'll be back in a second. The EU is keeping up what they promised to Ukraine 2 years ago, though that doesn't sound that particularly exciting for Kyiv. That's the summary of the latest Eastern Partnership summit hosted this week in Brussels and attended by the Ukrainian President Poroshenko. The partnership provides a platform for guiding relations between the countries of post-Soviet Eastern Europe and the European Union. My colleague Olga Tokaryuk talked to Brussels-based journalist Richard Jozwiak to discuss what promises Poroshenko got from the European Commission, as well the future of the EU cooperation with Georgia, Moldova, Armenia and Azerbaijan.
In a sense, the EU is keeping up what they promised 2 years ago, and that sounds really not particularly exciting and interesting at all. I understand Kyiv. But if you see it from the EU side and the problems, the internal problems the EU have had to come at least to this agreement, especially with the Dutch, it is something that Ukraine eventually will be somewhat happy about.
What is the Dutch position on Ukraine's European integration, given the recent referendum where the majority rejected it?
They had to, in December 2016, here in the Council, put up with that sort of supplement to the Ukrainian Association Agreement, which allowed the Netherlands to ratify the agreement earlier this year. And the Netherlands basically insisted that there should be a reference to this addendum to the Association Agreement. And the reason for that is simply that partly because they take this referendum seriously. and you can't take that away from them. They take that seriously. And secondly, because Netherlands until very recently haven't had a government. So they were basically sticking with their old lines all the time. Maybe with this new government that is very fresh, it's 1 month old, Ukraine and the Netherlands can work out a better relationship. But at the moment, this is the Dutch position, and Ukraine have to somehow accept that, even if it sucks, to put it out mildly.
In general, what do you think should be Ukraine's goals in cooperation with the European Union now? Because the visa regime is already there, the association agreement is already there, and sometimes Ukrainian officials say that they want more, like all this talk about the Eastern Partnership Plus Forum.
Yeah, I think, well, the main reason, I think, why Ukraine accepted the aspirations language, even though it was not particularly good, is that what I understand from Mr. Poroshenko's meeting with Mr. Juncker last night is that Mr. Poroshenko has got a sort of promise from the EU or the European Commission that the European Commission will look into what is called a feasibility study for Ukraine to see if Ukraine can join sometime in the future the customs union, the digital union and the energy union. Now, these three projects, if Ukraine can join, will be something that Ukraine really can work on in the future as well. I would add, within the digital union, one thing that I think can be something that Ukrainian government but also business can work on is to lower or perhaps even abolish roaming charges between Ukraine and the European Union. That's another thing that is very tangible for, I think, people.
Before the summit, EU officials, Commissioner Hahn was saying that before coming to the next level of cooperation, Eastern Partnership countries should first implement what is already there, and he stressed the importance of implementing the commitments taken in particular by Ukraine in terms of fighting corruption.
I understand always when I speak to them that they are frustrated. That's the word they use. We are frustrated. The reforms are not going fast enough, but in the same time they always say but. They understand that this is a huge issue for two reasons mainly. That one is that Ukraine is still in a war, and we have to accept that all the resources can't go to fight corruption because there is a real aggressor on the Eastern Front that is bothering Ukraine. So, of course, that is a problem. The second issue is as well that, yes, the EU can lecture Ukraine about corruption, but only so much. We have several very corrupt countries inside the European Union as well. So the EU is perhaps not always the best teacher when it comes to this as well.
What in general do you think about the future of the Eastern Partnership? Because in recent years there was a growing gap between the two groups of countries inside the Eastern Partnership. Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova on one hand, you have visa-free regime and association agreements, and Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, who have a very low-scale level of cooperation with the EU compared to others. Do you think Eastern Partnership should be reformatted in some way, maybe split in two?
That's exactly what I think. I know that I'm in some sort of minority, that everyone here, at least the officials, say that we should go on with Eastern Partnership. I don't really see the reason for that anymore. I think there should be a GUM summit or a MUG summit, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, whatever you want to put it. Those three countries should have maybe individual summits. Ukraine already has that. But as associated partner countries summit or something like that. I don't really think it makes sense for these 6 countries to be together anymore in this format. It's simply like there are 3 countries that eventually wants to become members of this club, and there are 3 countries that have no interest whatsoever. It doesn't make sense for these 6 countries to be together anymore. I can name at least 20 things that that keeps EU officials awake at night. Eastern Partnership is for sure not one of them. Right now, it's all about getting the economy going again, Brexit, managing still the potential migration crisis, and then working out the next EU budget. That's about the things they're going to think about. Not even Russia and the threat of Russia is particularly high on the agenda anymore. You can just look at the summit here today. Did Macron come? Did Rutte come? No. And when you saw the foreign press, I'm not talking now about Eastern Partnership press, the other press of the other EU member states, when they asked questions to their respective leaders, they didn't talk about the Eastern Partnership.
And following the topic, Rebecca Harms today is a co-president to the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly. It's an interparliamentary forum in which members of the European Parliament and the national parliaments of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine participate. So she calls on the European governments to keep the door to EU accession open and reflects on the results of the summit as well as how Europe can help solve the Russian-Ukrainian conflict at this stage.
I know that Ukrainian diplomats and also Petro Poroshenko was not really satisfied with the document. But the document is one thing, and the exchange with the European partners from in this huge round today was having another result. It showed a huge commitment to what we call so far the Eastern Partnership. There was nothing like a fatigue about the Eastern Partnership, but much more ambitious commitment to continue and to invest in the perspectives. And so I was positively surprised on many of the speeches. And the speeches by the heads of states, because not only Petro Poroshenko, but many of leaders of also the EU member states showed a quite clear understanding of the difficult situation Ukraine is in, and made it also crystal clear that the commitment from the side of the EU to Ukraine cannot be lowered, but must be strengthened. So there was a discussion, and you can always say what is now in the document, but in the discussion, especially also the contributions from the side of Euronest, what we did and some of the presidents and prime ministers were clear. And we see that so far there are no real results, not enough results by the Minsk process. Even Angela Merkel said she's not satisfied with the results, and this also makes then clear that we have to do more. We have now a summit ahead in which Europeans have to prolong the sanctions as long as Russia is breaking international law. In Europe, the sanctions will be in place, is what I would say. And afterwards, we have to decide how to continue. There are initiatives on the level of the United Nations on a stronger mission to Donbass. It's a very interesting debate, and I think everybody knows that we cannot go to business as usual with accepting this situation like in Donbass as they are. The news from Luhansk during the last days also alerted many people about the awful situation there.
Poland has long warned the West of Russia's threat to the global security. Now, with the war in eastern Ukraine, experts say the West is finally taking notice. But rapidly developing technology also means Russia now has much more powerful tools in its arsenal to influence the European and Western states. Hromadske sat down with Grzegorz Molecki, Director of Cybersecurity Programs at the Casimir Polansky Foundation, to discuss how Russia is spreading its influence and what this means for Poland's security.
Even this visible strengthening of our relations, and especially building awareness within NATO about threats from the east of Europe, from Russia. It's very important for us because we were trying to do that during the last 20 years without any effects. But I think that the decisive moment was the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So I think that due to this tragic events in Ukraine, the West understood that the situation is much more complicated, and even that they had thought earlier, and realized that Poles hadn't exaggerated in this area, in these questions in the past.
You're talking about this Russian threat. What are the concrete forms Russia influences or tries to influence Poland? I mean, economic or military issues. What are the concrete methods they use in Poland?
I think that in the whole range of aspects of areas, because the main goal of Russians is to make instability in the whole European sphere, especially making many conflicts between provoking, enhancing conflicts between EU member states, and also creating conflicts within the countries, especially making existing problems between different spheres, different circles, different sectors of the societies much bigger and bigger. So it's one point. The other is the main important areas of influence is energetic security, especially in this area, I think. The other is cyberspace. It's nowadays, thanks to the development of technology in the cyberspace, all services, all intelligence, all security sectors have new tools to do their job, using these tools. Also, Russian intelligence services, which follow very well-established traditional way of influencing in the sphere of mind, of awareness of Western societies. So nowadays, it's one of the most dangerous areas of the influence of Russians. Is changing way of thinking or influencing the decisions of Western societies, especially in Poland. We can see this influence. But what is important, Russians know very well our societies, Western societies, Polish societies also, and they use different things in different countries, having in mind a specific of the society. So they are masters in this field, because they made it. They have been made through the whole 20th century, but now they have in their hand new tools, much more powerful than in the past.
You've published with your colleague from Israel a very interesting report on cybersecurity. Why cybersecurity is important, and how can Poland use Israel experience?
Cybersecurity is very important for the one main reason, because cyberspace is present in all fields of human activities now. It's it's absolutely transversal issue. So it appears in all areas of activities of the people. So organizing, building a good system of managing of this cyberspace to make cyberspace secure is one of the most important goals for the government now. Why we think the Israelis case or example is good for us? Because they, in very short period, for almost 10 years, they made tremendous progresses in building such cyber ecosystem, cyber security ecosystem. Why? Because they were forced by the circumstances where they are living. So they are very well experienced. They have many good cases, good examples, which we can use building such system in Poland.
Thank you for watching. From the entire team of Hromadske International, we are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you. Follow us on social network. We are there all the time. Go to our webpage, en.hromadske.ua. There is more to follow. Again, thank you and goodbye, and see you soon.